Welcome to the History from the Archives. The recent printing of the 5,000 bill featuring Lapulapu stirred a lot of questions as to who Lapulapu really was. This episode will explore the historical Lapulapu based on available archival and documentary records. The earliest work that features the Battle of Mactan, authored by a Filipino, was contained in the book Brief History of the Philippines, which was published in 1919. But there was hardly any hint as to who Lapulapu really was. It only mentioned the battle between the natives and the Spanish forces, and it mentioned Lapulapu, and that's what we have. A potentially rich source of information, what published earlier, about 4 or 5 years earlier than that of Fernandez's book, authored by the Spanish mestizo Manuel Artigas y Cuerva, which featured the biographies of the illustrious Filipinos, unfortunately did not include Lapulapu because it only released 2 volumes, which only ended in the first few alphabetical arrangement. It only ended in the first few letters of the alphabet. So the letter L was not included in this volume. And probably Artigas y Cuerva probably was considering publishing multi-volumes which would probably include Lapulapu, but it never came out. So we virtually do not have any historical information as to who Lapulapu was other than what we have known from the accounts of Antonio Pigafetta. For this reason, other informations about Lapulapu, because of his enigma, apparently made Lapulapu a potential target for fictionalization and mythologizing. And that's precisely what happened to Lapulapu. We virtually do not know who he really was. The first mythical or legendary information that we got from him came out about early 1900s, which mentioned his roots as that of a son of Mangal, and they were supposed to have migrated from the Spice Islands, the Moluccas, and these clusters of islands in Indonesia. And we do not know who really was, but then based on that particular myth, he was a young man, and he was associated in that myth with this sort of an amulet. His power to strike an object using this pestle. And that's apparently how Lapulapu was identified in the story in Mactan, that he was very good at hitting something with his pestle. And for that reason, and in that particular account, Lapulapu was depicted as a young man. And that's probably how the myth of Lapulapu as a young man was perpetuated in history and immortalized in monuments, apparently without any historical basis, but merely based on myths and legends, which origin we cannot even trace. But then, aside from the little information provided to us by Antonio Pigafetta, nothing more is known about Lapulapu. And we took that as it is, as if that was the real Lapulapu at all. But my recent research, when I was working on my book, on the history of the expedition of Ferdinand Magellan, relying on primary documents, combing the archives in Europe, in Spain, Portugal, and Italy, came up to reach the conclusion that apparently what we know about Lapulapu is very, very limited and probably very, very inaccurate. So out of the available data, and because as I was going through my different several visits to the Archivo General de Indias, Museo Naval, and even in the archives of the Augustinians, because the Augustinians were the first religious orders which arrived in the Philippines, we realized that there are other sources from which we can piece together who Lapulapu really was. And among the primary informations we got was the personal account of Hines de Mapra. Hines de Mapra was among the crew who was with Magellan. He was there when the Battle of Mactan took place and survived the Battle of Mactan, was returning to Spain, but unfortunately he was caught by the Portuguese in the Spice Islands, and therefore he was imprisoned for almost 5 years. From there in the Spice Island, he was brought to Portugal and still suffered imprisonment for another year. But then, he wrote his personal account, and it killed to us certain informations we have never examined and never learned before. One of that is the information that says that Lapulapu and Humabon were actually brothers-in-law. In fact, Lapulapu's sister was supposedly married to Humabon. The other important source of information, and this is something that actually changed the whole picture of who Lapulapu was from the works of Gaspar Correa. Gaspar Correa was a Portuguese. He was not a Spaniard. But we have to understand the role of the Portuguese chroniclers in understanding the events, especially in the Battle of Mactan. The reason is because the Portuguese got hold of certain information when they captured the survivors of the Battle of Mactan. In fact, there were written documents that had been captured by the Portuguese. Among them were the writings of Andres de San Martin, the astronomer, so the cosmographer, so to speak, of the expedition. And therefore, the interrogations also made by the Portuguese authorities to the survivors of the Magellan expedition yielded valuable information used by the official chroniclers of the Portuguese and even the Spaniards. And Gaspar Correa, being the royal chronicler of the King of Portugal, certainly had access to these vital primary informations. And according to Gaspar Correa, and as I said, this is an information that changed virtually all that we know about Lapulapu. He says that Lapulapu was actually an old man when the Battle of Mactan took place. There was a line in the chronicle of Gaspar Correa that says that gave us the hint that Lapulapu was an old man. After the Battle of Mactan, Lapulapu was actually encouraging Humabon to shift his allegiance by killing the Spaniards. And because of this, Lapulapu informed Humabon that he would pardon Humabon of his alliance with Magellan when the Battle of Mactan took place if he would initiate the massacre of the Spaniards. And his promise is this: He says, I'm going to give you my wealth. I'm going to give you my daughter if you were going to kill them. After all, I am already an old man. Well, there are some people who doubted the translations from the Portuguese. But there are earlier works which apparently came out, which were already translated to English, which confirmed my translation of Gaspar Correa's Portuguese version, that he was certainly an older person. How old would he be? The Portuguese word says belho. That was the word used by Gaspar Correa, which in Spanish means is viejo, which in English, of course, it means an old man. Well, how do we know who or what is an old man during those times? Well, there is a certain kind of a crack in this gap between our knowledge of the present and during those times about who an old man was. The Spaniards in the 16th century identified a viejo as one who is a reservado. A reservado is one who is exempted from carrying out the obligations imposed by the colonial government, that is, paying taxes, paying tributes, and performing the forced labor. An old man, a viejo, is one who has already reached 60 years old and above. According to the 16th century Spanish colonial system of reckoning obligations among the native subjects, one who has reached the age of viejo is one who has reached the age of 60 or above. That would classify him as a reservado, which gave him exemptions from the colonial obligations, such as in the payment of tributes and in the performance of the forced labor. Probably the same principle applies to the Portuguese in their way of reckoning ages of their subjects. And for that reason, Lapulapu could have been more than 60 years old. Beyond that, we knew nothing more about who he was. The reason is because the natives of Mactan, after the Battle of Mactan, and when the Legazpi expedition landed in the Philippines, maintained a certain kind of rule of silence. Meaning to say, they avoided talking about the Battle of Mactan because of their fear for reprisals from Spanish authorities. And therefore, that's how the life of Lapulapu was sealed by silence from among the people themselves, and we never, of course, preserved any oral tradition based on eyewitnesses, based on eyewitness accounts of those who were present in the event and those who were alive during the time of Lapulapu. So, for this reason, the chapters on the biography of Lapulapu was closed even at the time when Lapulapu was still alive. We virtually knew nothing after the Battle of Mactan as to what really happened to Lapulapu after that. When did he die? There were some traditions that says that Lapulapu probably migrated to Biliran and some other clusters of islands in the Visayas, and apparently to escape the wrath of the Spaniards, because after the Magellan expedition, there were succeeding waves or succeeding expeditions that were sent. The Loaiza, the Saavedra, the Villalobos expedition, until 44 years after, from the Battle of Mactan in 1565, the Legazpi expedition arrived. But what we know is that when the Legazpi expedition arrived in Cebu at the time, Mactan was already abandoned by the residents. It was virtually described as uninhabited by people. So the possibility is, when the natives of Mactan learned that the Spaniards were coming, they must have abandoned them and were dispersed to various parts of the islands for fear that of the reprisal on the part of the Spaniards, who were very much familiar that the people of Mactan were the ones responsible for killing Ferdinand Magellan. Thank you very much for watching this episode, which explores the historical Lapulapu based on available data from archival materials. I hope that this brief discussion provides you with information which deepens our understanding who Lapulapu really was, so that we may be able to appreciate the celebration of the 500 years. For your questions, kindly write them down in the comment section, which will be answered in our next episode as we journey in our history from the archives.